Do, 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 do. Okay. Hello, hello, hello. Anybody who's watching this, we are, how do we want to introduce ourselves? We are the Verdant Collective and the Institute for Erotic Intelligence, and we are here today to talk to you about belonging. Belonging, one of our favorite topics that we talk about a lot, and is sort of the, not even sort of, it feels like it's the foundation or the motivation for everything that we get up to. It all comes back to belonging. Before we dive in, you can head to our website, www.instituteforeroticintelligence.com, and see any of the upcoming programs that we have. We have one in January, Eros, Ceremony and Belonging. That one is for women. Anyone who identifies as a woman is welcome to join us. That's a online weekend intensive. And then we have a 10-session course, ethics, I should know the names of these.
Source of embodied ethics.
We've changed it so many times.
Source of embodied ethics.
But
The
we
source
did
of
commit.
embodied ethics.
Right.
The source of embodied ethics, that one starts in March, and that one is for practitioners, anyone who is a practitioner of really anything, working with individuals one-on-one or leading groups. And that is sort of what this particular conversation we're going to have today is oriented towards, because the source of embodied ethics is
belonging.
Okay. So
we need to be like those old podcasts when they would have the symphony come in and say dun, 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 dun.
Podcasts, you mean radio shows?
Oh, that's right. Is that right? Was it yes, right. Right, where they, they're going to give a gift away or something.
Yeah.
And even more specifically, the quote that was what helped me tie this all together, that really turned into a bit of an epiphany when I first read it, was that the ethics are how we behave when we decide we belong, which is itself a really interesting thing to talk about, and a bit of a rabbit hole. But because do we decide we belong? How does this work?
That isn't.
And I also really love the responsibility of that it is really, it's sort of like belonging and deciding to belong. What we belong, we like to say we belong no matter what. It's whether we acknowledge that we belong. It's a physiological, it's a fact of physics that if we are here breathing, we belong. And depending on how geeky you want to get, even when we stop breathing, we belong, because we're in an enclosed, finite atmosphere of energy, and alive or dead, where it's all energy. So, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. We'd probably have to take a lot of mushrooms and then talk about that. We're not going to talk about that today. What we realized is that, well, all right, hang on. Belonging it's now a buzzword. It's now a thing you can pay high-priced coaches and consultants to come into your businesses and help cultivate, so everyone feels like they belong. And belonging is a personal growth word, and it's a self-help word, and it's a whole thing. It's sort of like got belonging, and if you don't, you're screwed. But what is belonging? What is belonging, and how do we know that we belong? What is it? How do we do it? Where do we do it? Are there different ways we feel our belonging? Can we feel we belong in this realm and not in this realm? Can we feel we belong to this part of the world and not that part of the world? And then in trying to maybe break it down a little bit, I channeled you, Alyssa, thinking, okay, you're the mistress of parting out these really big experiences that we invite people to have, to breaking it down and turning it into bite-sized pieces that are relatable, so we can get intimate with the constituent parts of it, is it useful to say that there might be physiological belonging or a sense of physical belonging, and that might go along with, or not, a sense of emotional belonging? Do we have a feeling of emotional belonging, but we might not have a sense of physical belonging? And then there's that word that we sort of wrestle with a lot, this sense of spiritual belonging. Is there a way to feel spiritually like I belong, but maybe I don't feel like I belong emotionally or physically? And these distinctions might or might not be helpful, but just in terms of, in an attempt to break something down that is so at once so essential and elemental, and also a little bit, ephemeral and trippy, and it's easy to kind of dissociate over here in this realm of belonging. I came up with those three potential categories of our belonging. And so, yeah, so I'm going to pause there and just even see what you're both thinking about at this point when it comes to that. Like, what
Muse,
catches
will you start? I have too many things.
Sure. Well, I'm sort of I'm back a little bit on the decide we belong, and what that means for me, or what that brings up for me. And what it brings up for me, it's a lens. It's okay, if I'm going to decide that I belong, then that must mean that I shift, or I engage with the worldview, or the one of me that can be nourished in that idea, or that can feel my belonging through putting my attention on what is working, on what is well, on what is whole, rather than in the despair of the feeling of not belonging. So, breath feels like the number one, easiest thing to do if we're talking about physiology. And I could go into that a little bit, but it sounds like something just sparked for you, Christiane.
Well, so what I am hearing you say then, Muse, is that belonging in some way, through the lens of deciding to belonging is a perspective or a frame of mind. It's a way of, is that?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about deciding to belong, then it is, to me, it's sort of making some sort of decision around how to engage. And that's at a base level thing, right? And then there are other ways that we can feed it.
Yeah.
Through that decision that we've made.
And so I think we have to, especially given the tenor of global culture right now, but really largely United States culture and what's happening here, and what's been happening for a number of years, but really most alive since the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, that any conversation around belonging, it may help to put cultural in there as well, that there's a cultural belonging and probably a very distinct experience of not even being invited culturally, being actively assaulted by certain cultures. Is it as simple as deciding we belong? We want to be careful as we talk about this, and I mean, I can say, growing up in the 60s, that I learned very quickly, because we were still in this place where the word man referred to everyone, that I felt very distinctly that I was not included in the culture, and that any idea I had, because I was a female, because I was not man, I was girl and woman, that any idea I had was like second status, and maybe we'll get around to that. But so there's even that, there's that nowadays that is very lucky, and it's about time. There's the question of how invited are we, just even culturally, and absolutely that affects us physically and emotionally. Maybe our spiritual sense of belonging gets to stay unscathed over here, but You know,
Yeah, I mean, to me, the cultural belonging piece is so far down the list because if our belonging comes from the culture that we belong to, particularly in this polarized time, that means that we don't belong to this other culture, right? If we belong to the right-wing culture, then we don't belong to the left-wing culture. And then when we have family members that are in the different culture than we're in, we can really feel our alienation and belonging from our families. So to me, it feels like the source of belonging has to be way underneath culture. Then that has me wondering, well, what are they doing in these businesses to belong to the business culture? You know, where's that coming
wouldn't
from?
that be interesting?
Yeah.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, I don't think it's a very so let's acknowledge. I'm just trying to I want to tune in here and see if there's anything else. There's so much we should say and need to say about our cultural belonging and what as a very homogenous group of three we are, where are our blind spots? And so we're going to say plenty, and we're going to keep identifying those. And what we're talking about in terms of belonging, it comes from a very specific lens. And and so then if we're going to talk about fundamental belonging, I'm almost at a place where I'm wondering whether fundamental belonging really does. So fundamental belonging starts very early on. We get the message pre-consciously as little gestating, without getting into any spiritual stuff about reincarnation and all of that. In each of our lives, we get the sense and the message that we belong from pre-consciously, which is a physiological process as gestating embryos, and then prenatal infants in a uterus that is benevolent or not. So that feels like the beginning of our physical belonging. We get a sense of the world being here and generous, and good things come our way, and it's safe. We're safe. There's room for us, or we don't. We get a very different sense depending on what messages are coming through. And that's, I'm going to say, because we don't have any data otherwise, that's mostly a physical experience that then creates the groundwork for so much else. So I'm curious if that feels too big or too, this is trauma theory that I'm talking about, and attachment theory.
I don't know that I have anything to say about that, except that I imagine there's a lot happening in all of those experiences that we're not, that we don't remember, that are very significant. And
we don't consciously
impact. And I say that because like my birth story has a lot of, there's a lot in it, and I'm aware of the impact that has had on my life and my nervous system, and so my relationship with human beings in general, and with the specific human beings that were and are I don't know if they still are my caregivers, but my parents, they certainly still give care. But so I imagine there's a lot of truth in that it goes all the way. And even before that, like if we start to think in our lineages and our epigenetics, and it goes way back and back and back.
Which
yeah, it's, I don't know what to say about all of that.
Well,
like
and maybe simply just acknowledging that it's that as physical beings who are deeply, deeply dependent as a species on the benevolence, generosity of each other, of our elders, of our parents, of our village people, of our family, of whatever we want to say, that physical belonging is a keystone experience of belonging. So you know, I think of people who were born, well, let's say you reference your birth story, and for people who are born in really born compromised, born tender and vulnerable, even more than the healthy, robust infant is tender and vulnerable for the next, you know, a good 7 to 11 years. That imprints on us a very specific way of orienting to the world. For somebody who ends up in the NICU for weeks, that's such a very particular imprint. And I'm not even talking about what doesn't happen because of that, in terms of contact, skin to skin, and care and quiet, and that attachment, that initial secure attachment possibility.
Well, there's also like too many, I'm having a hard time getting words to make their way to my mouth, but I spent a short amount of time in the NICU, and about a week or so. So not a huge amount, but that's, you know, it's been significant for me. And there's a feeling for me throughout my life where my belonging is so not about human beings. I mean, it is like I have that layer. I've learned how to belong with other human beings, but that's been a learned thing. It was so much more like me and some, I guess maybe more the spiritual belonging that you were pointing to. Like that's been really easy. And there's some feeling for me that that access was created for me or was ignited while I was alone, essentially, in the NICU. Like I've had experiences where going back to that in trauma therapy, in other practices of like, oh, a lot happened there that actually set in motion some really beautiful things about how I relate with the world that have had helpful implications for me.
Yes.
Like thinking about as a adolescent, you know, the things that 13-year-old girls do with each other is nasty. And even when it's fairly benign, it's really hard because we're so tender as these little teenagers. And what I think some of what got me through that, so much of what got me through that was like, well, it doesn't matter what you think about me because I have this connection that is so much bigger than my belonging with this group of girls.
Yes. Yep. And even with that, I dare say that there are plenty of, you know, dark nights of the soul and deep loneliness and that sort of thing that happen in there because our need to belong, it's not even a longing to belong, our need to belong. We're human beings in this lifetime. So I hear you. And that makes me think of ancestor work. I'm just starting to identify as we are talking here that there are, if I were going to do any sort of belonging assessment, multi-dimensional sort of cross-discipline or whatever we want to call it, belonging assessment for each of us to be able to start to break down this big thing called belonging. As I have done ancestor work with folks over the last few years, there are folks who take to it really easily because it's totally possible to imagine that I come from really well people. And then there are folks who completely understandably, this especially in our culture is the deep wound of our culture, that it's just like, no way do I come from good people. Because look at Aunt Harold or Aunt Ethel and Uncle Harold, and look at my grandma and my great grandfather, and they're horrible people and alcoholics and abusers and that sort of thing. And there's no belief, there's no ability to imagine that there's a deeper belonging of my lineage that I could come from that could be good and I could belong to it. And so I'm this would be more of just a way for us each to test our belonging. For folks who are listening to this, can you imagine, is it impossible to imagine that you could come from, you could belong to a wellness, a vein of wellness? Yeah. And that feels so, that would be one of the first places to start is, can you even imagine that? Can you imagine that that could be possible? And for many of us, it's not, understandably. Yeah. What do you think, Muse?
I love that because to me me feeling like the pressure is off for it to all come down to me. And even earlier to what I said, like the decisions that I make about how I relate with the world. And we are agents of our lives, and yet if we can lean back, I mean, we often, three of us often talk about the web of wellness. And if one of those nodes of the web of wellness is where we came from, the ancestry, our lineage, then there's something about that that's like, oh, I must have a seed of that here within me. And there's something that just feels connected and sweet about that as a starting place.
It feels like there's something really important. You were sort of talking about this at the beginning, Christiane, of you didn't say it in exactly this way, but where we choose to put our belonging. There's something that we could do in there that feels really radical and revolutionary because we're expected or we're trained to belong to a very particular culture and way of being that we learn through media, through family, through religion, through what, all of these different sources. It sort of gets crammed down our throats. And so recognizing that's a creation,
Yes.
that's a human creation, and that there's other places and other ways that we can belong feels really revolutionary, and that's maybe more of what we're I don't know if that's more of what we're talking about, but it feels like an important component.
And I mean, you each have written about this, and we've taught about this in our courses, our online courses that we've done this last whatever year, I guess.
Craziness.
We want to be really careful to place our belonging in popular culture, or otherwise known as consumer culture, or patriarchal culture, capitalist culture, Western industrial culture. As our friend Reverend Terry Chalky would say, the fading Uber culture, which is really good. Put it in its place. That culture is very all too happy and well endowed with the mechanisms of the enslavement of what it looks like to belong to it, and the various things we have to become, and the contortions, and the self alienation, and all of those different things we have to do in order. It's like just a grand circus act of inhumanity to figure out how to belong to the popular culture as the popular culture tells us we should. And if we do that, then there is almost, I don't know, here, I'll make a almost declarative, there's almost no way to belong, to have any real intrinsic belonging, because the very purpose of that is to sever your radical taproot from your intrinsic belonging. That if we all just intrinsically belonged, the world would be a very different place. Western industrial culture would be a very different place.
And it also seems like belonging to this Uber culture that you were talking about also requires us to ostracize parts of ourselves, to prune and to nip and to only show specific facets. And so there's no foundational piece there, so that when we're home alone in our rooms contemplating our lives, and we have all these parts of ourselves that we hate or that we suppress or that we shut down or leave behind, there is no belonging, then the belonging comes right back to, okay, let me pick up my phone and remember, this thing that I'm interacting with, instead of this thing and this thing, the wider world that we can, this web that I mentioned a few minutes ago.
Yeah. And so where then, now that we've kind of piled it on in terms of, oh my God, what kind of obstacles and feats of miraculous, whatever does it take to actually feel our belonging? I'm brought back to the power of I want to demystify it at the very least. Clearly, we're going to have part 2 and part 3 of this conversation. And maybe if part 1 really is just demystifying belonging, that belonging doesn't mean that, well, let's just say that, how about this? Feel free to just trounce this, but how about if belonging simply starts with my acknowledgement that there is a place for me on this earth simply because I am here. Can I even just get with the reality, the fact that I am here and I'm breathing, and maybe that's all that's true, because my belly might be so empty, and I might actually, there might be all these things that I, sitting here in my beautiful little home and my beautiful little study, talking on my computer with you about the luxury of belonging, I can't even fathom, all the different things that could assault my sense of belonging. But where does it start? And can it start with, it's something like, I am here, therefore I belong.
Updated Cartesian philosophy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I wonder about actually going a layer deeper.
Ooh,
and
good.
looking at like DNA sort of studies where we have so much in common with other, like our DNA is so similar to mushrooms and trees. Like we have overlap with all of these beings, and we're made of the same stuff. And we're made of stuff that comes from stars, and
Yes.
that, like, there's something about that for me that lands it in a different way, because there's an interconnectedness that starts to come in, because I can be like, yeah, I'm breathing and I'm here, but that doesn't mean that I belong to anyone or anything. I might just be here alone as all get out. But
interesting. Okay.
that's what
Right.
happens for me. Or taking it another step and coming back to the breath and remembering or acknowledging maybe for the first time that the breath that's in me. I read some study, they with certain chemicals, or not chemicals, but molecules that are in the air, that there's certain number of those that have been in your body that were also in Jesus' body, if he were a real living breathing person, but that we're breathing the same air that our ancestors breathed, that every human being, every respirating being has breathed ever. And that I don't know if there's a difference between interconnectedness or interdependence and belonging. They feel really related in me, but they're distinct but related. But those things of feeling those connections connects me in with belonging a lot more than you're speaking to.
And there's the thing I'm tapping into here is that we could get really mystical about that, and it's also just a measurable,
it's like
physiological fact. Yes.
And so for me, a practice of that I just do love so much doing is attuning and breathing with another. And so that could be a human. An animal is a really wonderful companion to just feel the breath, feel the heartbeat of another, and feel my own. And there's something in there that, okay, now I'm not alone. And even to go another less animate route, I've done this with trees to where, and it takes it into an imaginal realm a little bit, but there is something really physical about it. And I'm more of a feeler, I would say, than a thinker. So
you don't say.
And so to come around and to actually embrace and hug a tree and start to listen. And then I've had this experience where I can feel my heartbeat, but then somehow that heartbeat becomes the tree's heartbeat, beating itself back to me. And I'm like in this dynamic relationship with this thing that's also breathing, it feels like, or I can tap into that. And then from there, there's this other quieter, deeper listening that starts to happen. And the thoughts, the negatives, the goes away. And then all of a sudden there I am connected. And so, to take it into a practical realm, rather, I mean, we can imagine it and then we can actually physically feel it, because no matter what, if we are alive, our heart is beating and our respiration is breathing. And
Yes.
so is everything else.
Yeah.
And really physically connecting with that makes a difference for me. It blows me away sometimes.
Well, I appreciate that it is so mystical, and I appreciate that the way you're describing it gets us so much closer to the practicality of that, almost like the responsibility of that, to, and maybe for some of us more than others even, to practice the practicality of that grounding, re-embedding, invitation.
I have another one.
Great.
It sort of goes, I think I read this from Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't want to take credit for it. I want to give credit where it's due. But he spoke about, one of the main tenets of Buddhism is that you don't have you're not separate. And he was answering the question, that is separate from what? And because that's an important question to be asking. If we're not separate, what are we not separate from? And the practice that he came out with it from that was, when you sit down to eat a meal, thinking into all of the people that were a part of getting that to be sitting in front of you, from whoever grew it, however it got from the farm to the store, however it got from the truck onto the shelves, into your hand, all of the steps that go into us actually just having some vegetables sitting in front of us, or whatever it is.
Yes.
That we're, and it's just another way to remember that we belong. And then what we often talk about is feeling the ways that we're actually supporting the web of life that we're in, and starting to recognize, what are the ways that I'm actually contributing here, even in small ways. Like I feed and walk my dog, and that's contributing to her life, which sort of ripples out in other ways. But simple things like that we're doing that are in support of life, and that can help us to see and feel our belonging.
Yeah, I think, that might be one of our, maybe part 4 or something. I don't know. Maybe it's part of the spiritual and emotional belonging, is just, what good am I? Of what good am I? And I hate to use the P word, purpose, because it's been so popularized. And now there's I'm going to go to my workshop on discovering my purpose. And that's great. And there's also a little bit of, self-indulgence there. And that I have this one purpose, and I'm going to pay somebody else to tell me what it is. But my capacity to feel like I am measurably contributing to the things that I hold most dear is an essential component of my belonging, of my, that I'm, it's important that I'm here. And what a can of worms that is, isn't it, in this grandiose culture, where we can just come up with all sorts of reasons why the world is a better place because we're here, when the reality of that is probably, it's a kind of a crapshoot there. What are we contributing to? But to really feel like we do belong, because we are benevolently contributing, and is a whole other thing, and a thing that's not available to a lot of us. so that we actually are doing something that makes a difference. So yeah. Okay, so we have at least part 2 and 3 to do.
Like, oh my
How super
God.
exciting is
I don't know that
that?
we answered any of these questions. It's good. I like that it's made out to be such a simple, trite thing. This is where we started. Like, oh,
Yeah.
belonging. It's become this catchphrase and
Yes.
this thing. And it's like what
Yep.
culture was in businesses. I've never been in corporate businesses, but I know that that's been like culture was the big thing. And it sounds like now belonging is the big
Absolutely.
thing.
Yep.
And I just am appreciating how not simple it is. I mean, it is simple, but how complex it is simultaneously.
Yeah.
And woven, it's woven into everything. And it's certainly everything that we do. It's not only woven into, it's like distilled down to, and then expanded out. Yeah.
Well, I could say, I mean, we could even just have this be one of the cliffhangers, is that it seems so clear that part of the deep divide in our country, all the divides, so many of the divides in our country come from a really just a catastrophic experience of not belonging and trying to belong or needing to belong, and the vulnerability that that we that is us, and the danger that comes from that vulnerability when we don't belong, and when our sense of belonging, our sense of fundamental belonging is compromised. That we still have to figure out why. How many people? 81. I don't even know. My numbers are not ready. But however many folks voted for Trump.
74 million.
74 million. There we go. And I don't mean to be. I would hope to try to stay bipartisan or multi-partisan, nonpartisan. But for those of us who are deeply concerned, and we can't for a minute think that we've accomplished anything simply by putting Biden in office. We have half our country, potentially more than half our country. Our country is divided, and it's very likely because of an experience of needing to belong. And, it's for some folks, it's simply impossible to feel represented by someone like Joe Biden. And that makes perfect sense to me. So how on earth do we approach each other and bridge the divide and the gap when something as fundamental as belonging is thrown in the mix? So
like that's like part 12. I love it. But
one of our right one of the answers of our profession would be just find more pleasure.
More orgasms, you'll be fine.
That's it. Just more, bigger, better, louder, longer.
Okay, we better stop.
Yeah. Okay. We're almost at the So
All right.
can we leave it at that?
I think
Feels
we can.
like an open can of worms.
Well, let's ask
in
a
good
question.
ways.
Let's ask a question. And for anyone watching and wanting to participate in the conversation, how do you, if you feel like you belong, how do you know? How do you know? What are some of the ways you experience your belonging? And if you don't, what are some of the ways you don't? So that feels like a really important place to start.
Okay.
There we go.
So check out our website. I'll send you all back to there. instituteforeroticintelligence.com. Everything that's upcoming is there. And we do these conversations roughly every other week. That's the plan. So we'll likely be back in a couple weeks with a different, potentially related topic, since this seems to be so rich. So stay tuned. And if you want to catch past videos that we've done, you can find them on our website as well under the resources tab. Okay.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thank
Have
you.
a good rest of your day.
Bye.